Hey everybody, Quantum here, and in this video we're going to be reviewing the Sapphire ink color for Shimmering Skies. This is one of the inks that I think really came out ahead in this set, and we'll go over some of the better cards that were released. Let's go ahead and jump straight in. Starting off, we've got King Candy. This is your generic 1-cost inkable 2/2 body with a shift target later on, nothing too significant there. The Chicha, again, maybe just a draft card, a 4-cost inkable 4/3 body that quests for 2, nothing too significant there either. We are seeing, I think, Ravensburger head into a direction where they want to make villain characters kind of their own archetype, so we have a lot of different Maleficents. In this set, we also got a lot of different queens, a lot of which have the ward ability, so this might be something to consider moving forward if you, I don't know, are a fan of the queen. I'm not sure too many people would be, but this character being a 2-cost inkable with ward is basically a location for 2 that can quest for 1. It's a 0/4 body, but it is a potential shift target for a number of different queens, some of which were released in this set. Moving on, we've got Scrooge McDuck. This is a 4-cost uninkable 5/5 body that quests for 2, so definitely some really good stats. The drawback being that it is uninkable. Not a card I think we'll see too much play outside of draft and or maybe some budget decks, just because the 4-cost slot in Sapphire is kind of awkward if you go for the ramp strategy, because either Mickey or Fishbone Quill will allow you to skip turn 4 and play a 5-cost character or action on turn 4. So turn 4 is really only used for Hiram, but again, this is not necessarily a bad card. It's just it doesn't really fit in with Sapphire's overall strategy, I don't think. Next up, we've got a 3-cost Prince John. So again, we're seeing more kind of prime villain characters or main villain characters getting additional support. This is Opportunistic Briber, a 1/5 body, so very underwhelming for 3, but it is inkable. It only quests for 1. It has a nice little perk that whenever you play an item, this character can get +2 strength this turn, becoming a 3/5. Unfortunately, it's not a permanent boost like the Radigan and Ruby, which if it has damage on it, it will maintain a 3/5 body. This one, you have to play an item every turn in order to proc this ability. So again, not something that's too good, but we never know. We might see a Prince John archetype emerge over time. Unfortunately, the Merlin shift target that we got in Sapphire for the new legendary Merlin, the Visionary, is not very good. It is a 4-cost inkable 1/4 body, so again, just underwhelming stats for this this cost. And it says your damage characters named Arthur gain resist +1 and it quests for 2. So this ability is completely irrelevant. I would have preferred maybe a 3/4 body that's a vanilla and can quest for 2, because we have the I shouldn't call it a vanilla, but it pretty much is a 4-cost 3/4 body in the first chapter for a Merlin that will quest for 1 but has support. And that's probably the better Merlin over this one. This one just not relevant. There's not enough Arthurs, not enough Arthurs that you would want to play. So it just doesn't really gel with the overall strategy. And as we know, most of the good Merlins that you would want to play are in Amethyst, right? Such as Goat and Rabbit. Next up, we have our first, in my opinion, meaningful card in the set, in Pacha Emperor's Guide. So this one might not see too much play right now, but it has a lot of potential in the future, especially if we get more good locations and items. And I think good items are definitely going to come. Locations, I don't know how they feel about the design of them. Obviously, when they first came out, they were very, very powerful, and they've obviously scaled that power level back. But it's a 3-cost inkable 0/4 body that quests for 2. Not that you'd be doing too much questing with this unless you're absolutely sure it's going to be safe. But at the start of your turn, if you have an item in play, gain a lore, and the same for a location. So that means if you have an item and a location in play, you will gain 2 lore at the start of your turn. Plus you can quest with this and gain an additional 2 lore. So this character in and of itself is like a location and or item in just sitting there and gaining you passive lore. So another tool for Sapphire to use to gain lore without questing, which is very interesting. And if your opponent doesn't have an out to this, if it just sits in the ready state, it could be very problematic for them to deal with. That being said, though, all the Ruby strength-based removal will take this out. The Muses and stuff on Emerald will take this out. There is a lot that can deal with this, and just steal damage-based spells, etc. So they didn't make it overpowered by any means. There's a lot of ways to deal with it, but if it does hit the board and survive a couple of turns, it can be a bit problematic. One of the super rares we got is a new The Queen, Fairest of All, so again, just supporting that whole Queen archetype. And this is a 5-cost inkable 2/6 body that has shift 3, ward, and so again, another Queen with ward. It only quests for 1, but then it says for every other character named The Queen you have in play, this character gets +1 lore. So later on my channel, or later on, I guess, I'll be posting a video where I faced up against my friend who used an Amber Sapphire Queen base deck. He was playing 28 The Queen characters, and they all synergize very well with each other. So if you're interested in that, stay tuned. He was playing this and the other Queens as well. But yeah, it's an interesting card that can definitely work within its own archetype, right? But obviously it's a card that you would build around. Not anything top tier by any means, but just something fun, right? And it should be relatively cheap, right? Like look at the cost of this thing. It's super cheap to build as a fun deck if you're a fan of the Queen. Next up, we have another card that could potentially be relevant, similar to the Gaston that I reviewed in Ruby, the Sheriff of Nottingham Bushel Breeches. So this is a 9-cost uninkable. So again, every color got one of these that can reduce its cost under a certain condition. It is a 5/9 body, so similar to the legendary Mufasa that we got. It does quest for 4, and it has support, but it has a nice ability that says for each item you have in play, you pay 1 less to play this character. As we know, both Ruby and Steel versions of Sapphire can play and do play a lot of items, anywhere between 14 to 22 usually, depending on the build, and that can instantly reduce this card's cost down to 5 very early, or even 0, right? If you have that many items in play, which is unlikely, but it could happen. Regardless though, paying 4 or 5 for a 5/9 body that quests for 4, the support doesn't really come up too much probably, but it could, but that would be very, very strong. The downside is obviously if you see this early on in the game, it's going to be very, very bricky and it's not going to do anything for you. That being said, being in Sapphire has an additional advantage unlike all the other colors in that you have access to something like Fishbone Quill where this could be inked, whereas in other colors if you draw their 9-cost uninkable characters, it's just dead in your hand for many turns until you fulfill the conditions and can play it out. So this one is one of the ones that aren't very bad. A really strong stat line, very hard to deal with, a good dime target, it has a lot of things going for it. Getting out a big body early, that kind of thing, very hard to deal with. So another card that's potentially pretty good. So far in my opinion, we've got Pacha, we've got Sheriff, and then the other one that caused a lot of waves when it first came out, a lot of people were excited about this one, is Chicha, Dedicated Mother. So a 2/1 uninkable body for 2, quest for 1, not that you'd be doing much questing with this, and good that it doesn't have ward, because if it had ward it would probably be broken, but it does have support, which I've talked about this in the past, where in order for Ravensburger to make support good, I think they have to just put it as a supplemental ability onto characters that already have good abilities, and then you're like, oh yeah, I have this character with support, I can just use that to help maybe facilitate something later on. But usually with these kind of characters, you're not going to be wanting to quest with them anyways, because keeping this in a ready state and keeping it protected is probably what you want to do, considering its ability allows you to draw cards. It says during your turn, when you put a card into your inkwell, if it's the second card you've put into your inkwell this turn, you may draw a card. So keep in mind it's only the second card, so if you ink for turn and then you use a Fishbone Quill to do a second ink in the turn, you will be able to draw a card off Chicha. Now if you play a Mickey Mouse Detective to ink a third time in the turn, you will not draw off Chicha. It only works for the second time you ink in the turn. But it's still a very powerful draw engine. A lot of different Sapphire cards that are played in a lot of the meta relevant decks, like Mickey Mouse Detective, the Fishbone Quill, Great Stone Dragon, and even now what we'll take a look at in just a bit, the new Donald Duck Focused Flatfoot will also be able to utilize the card draw off of this Chicha, essentially making your ink ramp free, right? More or less. Even if you go back to playing things like the 2-cost Grammatala, if you can banish her during your turn, when you ink during your turn, you'll be able to draw a card for that as well. Moving on, we've got a super rare, a Prince John, a 4-cost inkable 3/4 body that has a very nice ability that you can exert to play an item for free from your hand or discard with cost 5 or less for free. But it comes into play, exert. So similar to the Queen, which costs 3 and is a 3/3 body that you can exert and scry 4 to put an item into play that's 3 cost or less for free, this card will also allow you to gain advantage by playing items from your discard. You might be thinking like, well, Popsicle only costs 1, but still being able to play a card to draw a card is very, very strong, and having 4 willpower can make this a little tough to out at times. So it's a pretty good card overall. The issue is, again, the 4-cost slot, which we discussed earlier, and how relevant is this card going to be to other options that you'll be able to play in Sapphire-based decks. Not something I see displacing other good cards that you need to play in order to react to your opponent's threats. This card helps you develop your board, but you have enough board development within these colors already, which makes me think this card probably doesn't see play, despite it having a pretty powerful ability. But you never know, in the future, we might get that really good 5-cost or less item that makes this card all the much better for being able to recycle it. Moving on, we've got another The Queen, Crown of the Council. So this one is a very interesting card for the archetype. It's a 4-cost uninkable 3/2 body, but it has ward, so it can't be targeted by things like Let the Storm Rage On, but it does get wiped out by something like Grab Your Swords. It does quest for 2, it is a rare, and it has an ability that when you play this character, you can look at the top 3 cards of your deck, reveal any number of character cards named the Queen, and put them into your hand, and then put the remaining cards on the bottom of the deck. So this card, if you watch the gameplay video that I'll post later with my friend using the Queen deck, can actually get you a pretty decent amount of card advantage. You can hit 2 or even all 3 queens off of this, and then you just replenish your hand very nicely. So an in archetype hand draw card, I guess you can say, which is kind of cool. Okay, moving on to the second half of the characters here, we are going to come to what is maybe the most impactful card, along with the Donald, in the Kuzco Selfish Emperor. So this is a 6-cost inkable, which is huge, being inkable. A 3/5 body that quests for 2. So, overall okay stats. Good that it quests for 2 and is a body. But obviously you're playing this because it allows you to banish, I shouldn't say banish, I guess you'll put a chosen item or location into its player's inkwell face down and exerted. This can help you self-ramp, but it can also obviously out some very big threats that Sapphire would suffer against in the metagame, right? Mirror matches with the opposing player being on Lucky Dime. If they opt to develop their dime first and waiting to play their character after, you can then come down with the Kuzco and put the dime in the inkwell, which means they cannot recur it with the Tamatoa, right? In the past for Sapphire Steel, let's say you've maybe beast hard-headed the Lucky Dime, but then they just follow up with the Tamatoa and get the Lucky Dime back. So all you really did was put them behind a turn, and you were too busy reacting to their board, so you don't really develop anything yourself. Whereas this card just makes it so that you tell them, you have to be very careful with how you use your dime now, because once it goes to your inkwell, you're not getting it back most likely, right? So a very interesting card, something that I think Sapphire would prefer to play over the Steel Simba, at least Sapphire Steel, where the Steel Simba allows you to just outright banish the item or location. But obviously Sapphire having a weakness against things like the Queen's Castle, this also helps you deal with it. The final thing I'll say about this is you normally don't want to play this in an instance where you would ramp your opponent, just because, giving them that extra ink before they get to like 7, let's say, especially in the case of Ruby decks where they're on Be Prepared, can be very detrimental. But when they're on like 7, 8, 9 ink, giving them that extra ink usually won't matter too much. It might hit a break point for them to play multiple interactions in a turn, like let's say Goat, Fox, Goat for 10 ink, but usually it's not going to matter all too much. And the scenarios where it's going to hurt you become significantly less if you end up putting that item or location into the inkwell much later in the game compared to much earlier. And then it does have a side ability. You can pay 4 ink and your characters gain resist +1 until the start of your next turn. So if you have no other real interactions to play in a turn, it's good to have this passive ability on it that you can just activate and wait to play something on your next turn where you can draw a card. Moving on, we have the Chase Enchanted, in my opinion, of the whole set, in Mufasa, Ruler of Pride Rock. So this card has probably the most relevant stat line in the game right now. It is an 8-cost uninkable, which does hurt, but again, in Sapphire, you can get there pretty quickly, and this card can be inked technically if you have Fishbone Quill. But a 4/9 stat line represents being able to dodge Medusa and all the Sisus without being ice blocked down. It has to be ice blocked down first before it would be affected by those. And the 9 toughness represents just, very, very difficult to out. It can survive a Maui challenge if it's exerted. It can survive Zeus. Your opponent will need a lot to throw into this, especially when it's readied up, if they want to take it out. And once it hits the board, you definitely will want to take it out because, yeah, it's going to be pretty threatening. What I will say is I don't think this price is warranted for this card right now. I do think it's very overvalued because there's no way you run 4 of this in any Sapphire deck, I wouldn't think. But the abilities are very powerful. When you play this character, you exert all cards in your inkwell, so obviously you will use up all your ink before you play this for the first time, or as much ink as you can. And then you return 2 cards at random from your inkwell into your hand. So this can actually help with card advantage, especially considering that you may ink things you would likely not ink later on in the game. Like, in your opening hand, if you ink a Tamatoa, you're like, yeah, because I'm not going to get to this for a couple turns, so let me ink this now, and then you might get it back later. It is a little bit of RNG, which is not great, but getting 2 resources back to just play out or ink again, even if you want, isn't necessarily bad. So I think the ability for Sapphire works very well. And then you have the second ability. If this thing does survive, it's absolutely like a game-winning card when it quests, because you can then, when you pass it to your opponent, they pass back to you. If this card is still on the board, you can play out a couple of interactions, quest with the Mufasa, ready up all your ink again, and then play out even more action. So we always talk about playing multiple interactions in a turn. Well, this card allows you to basically double them technically, right? So very, very powerful. And again, if you do get the ability off, it's more or less a game-winning ability. So, you know, maybe the price is considering that it's a main character from a main movie. I mean, I don't know if I'd call Mufasa a main character, but it's a very powerful card, a very powerful effect, and people just want them. But like I said, because it's not played out of 4 of, you don't need playsets. So for competitive players who are playing Sapphire, I don't think you need a playset, and that shouldn't be driving the price. Next up, we've got Ludwig von Drake. This is a 5-cost inkable 4/4 body that quests for 3. Pretty good in draft, but other than that, I don't see it being too relevant. We've got Minnie Mouse, a 1-cost uninkable 1/2 character, and every ink color got one of these 1-cost effect that aligns with the ink in their set. So think like Cogsworth, the 1/1 that is also a 1-cost that comes into play and gives rush. The Simba coming in giving strength, that kind of thing. This one comes into play and a character gets -2. Quest for 1. So while it is good, I'd rather just play Ice Block because we know how focused on items that Sapphire is. And Ice Block just fits that much better. Next up, you've got another 1-drop, something that is definitely relevant in Basil, Practice Detective. This is a 1-cost inkable 2/1 body, so away from your traditional 1/2/2 that is a vanilla. And this one has support and a quest for 1. And support normally, like I mentioned, is not very good, but in an instance on it being on a 1-drop is actually relevant, especially because Daisy Duck is a thing. So the immediate thing that comes to mind here is being able to play Basil on 1 if your opponent goes Daisy Duck. Or let's say your opponent goes Daisy Duck on turn 1, so you're on the draw, which is, you're already going to be behind against an aggro deck, and you're like, okay, Basil on 1. Then they go drop, ink and play something else, quest with the Daisy, that gets them 2 lore, they reveal a character for you, and hopefully get some card advantage. What you can then do on your turn is, let's say if you're on Ruby Sapphire, you go back to playing something like the Queen, the Queen of Hearts, and then you go drop Queen of Hearts for 2 ink, or ink and play Queen of Hearts, quest with Basil, give Queen of Hearts +2 from the support. Now Queen of Hearts is a 4/2 body with rush, use it to take out the Daisy Duck right away. So they only get 1 quest in and you out the threat, right? So there are those kind of lines of play that make this card kind of interesting being on 1. I think that's definitely the way that you should be developing things like support, because once it's very late in the game, like, it doesn't really do too much. I shouldn't say it doesn't do too much. It's just hard to get the ability off and off to a point where it is relevant, right? So yeah, there are those things to consider, but Basil, pretty good card overall, I think. King Candy is a very interesting one as well. 5-cost uninkable 3/3 body that shifts 3 and quests for 2. When you play this character, you may draw 2 cards and then put a card from your hand to the bottom of your deck. So a pretty nice ability, enabling you to get rid of some bricky cards, draw 2 cards. I think it's a good card, but it is uninkable in and of itself, and it's only a 3/3 body. Oops, misclicked there. The other best card in the set, in my opinion, so I think that Cusco and this Donald Duck Focus Flatfoot are probably the 2 best. Hard to say which one is better. Probably the Cusco being more relevant, but the Donald Duck is something that can be included in every single Sapphire deck moving forward. So this is a 5-cost inkable 3/4 body that quests for 2. And it has the same ability as the Mickey Detective, as when you play this character, you may put the top card of your deck into your inkwell face down and exert it. What's really nice about this card is that the 5 costs for the stats are pretty relatively decent, especially for the fact that it quests for 2. But being a 5-cost card means that if you do ramp with Mickey or with Fishbone on turn 3, you're able to skip turn 4, right? Or, on your turn 4, I should say. Instead of having to play a 4-cost card, you can opt to play something like Donald, which will give you that extra ink resource again, which means that if you Fishbone again, you can play an 8-cost card on turn 6, or a 7-cost card the next turn, right? If that works out correctly. Oh, sorry, no, what am I saying? So on turn 4, you play a 5-cost card. If you're able to double ink on turn 5, you'll play an 8-cost card. If you're only able to ink once off the Donald again, you've inked off Fishbone, you can play a 7-cost card on 5. So there are a lot of different options that you could play depending on what ink pairing you're using Donald and Mickey or Sapphire in general with. But being able to play out those big bombs a turn or 2 early can be super relevant. And this Donald Duck also quests for 2 and is somewhat hard to out in 4 toughness. So I really do think this is one of the better cards in the set for sure. Next up, we got Tanana, Wise Woman, a 2-cost inkable 1/3 body that quests for 1. When you play this character, you may remove up to 1 damage from chosen character or location. Not very relevant, even for draft, I wouldn't think. You got Tipo, Growing Sun, 2-cost inkable 1/2 body. When you play this character, you may put a card from your hand into your inkwell face down and exerted. So it's basically 1 jump in character form, but instead of coming from the deck, it comes from your hand. So you can argue that this is worse, but 1 jump is a song, which can be ripped with Ursula Deceiver. Tipo is not, so there is that to consider as well. Next up, we've got Belle of the Ball, a 4-cost inkable 2/3 body with ward, and when this character comes into play, you may your other characters will gain ward until the start of your next turn. It does quest for 2, so it is sort of relevant, and it can't be targeted with anything for the removal like Brawl and stuff. So it's an interesting card. Being uninkable does hurt it. Again, is there enough room for this card to displace anything else in Sapphire? I would not think so. I don't necessarily need ward on my big characters once I start dropping them, and as we know, Sapphire is usually not a color that goes super wide on their board, so giving ward to everything for a turn probably doesn't matter too much, since if you play this in like Sapphire Steel or Sapphire Ruby, you only have 1 or 2 threats on the board anyways. This spell isn't really doing much to protect those because, yeah, even though they're not targeted for the turn, there's other ways to out them, right? The final character is Merlin, Intellectual Visionary. This is a 6-cost uninkable 3/7 body that shift 5, and you have to shift it in order to get the ability to search your deck for any card and put that card into your hand. Very, very powerful ability. They finally introduced a tutor into Lorcana. I really don't think you see this happening all that often, if any, so this was probably going to be the only card of this kind of power that we see for a while. And what's interesting is my friend mentioned to me that if you do shift this on top of like Merlin Rabbit or Merlin Goat, you will be able to draw a card and or gain a lore, depending on which one you shift it on, when you shift this target, because it counts as them leaving play. I don't know if anybody can verify that for me, but that is very interesting, and it makes this card and blue-purple much more of a viable option moving forward. I don't really think you're able to play this effectively in any other ink combination, just because the Merlin we got in this set, the shift target is very bad, and the only good one you'd play is the Sapphire one, which isn't very good to begin with. So I definitely think the place for this is in Amethyst Sapphire, which it can definitely do some good work in. What's really beneficial about a card like Merlin is if you search out a song, and you know we're bound to get more and more powerful songs, you can sing it right away most likely, right? With the 6 cost of this card. If you search out a character, you likely have to wait a little bit before you can play it out, right? Especially if you shift the Merlin on curve or a little early. But it does help you set up for the next couple of turns, which is nice. Like imagine just searching out an Elsa Spirit of Winter from chapter 1, knowing full well that you're going to be able to tap down your opponent's board and then quest for game next turn anyways. So pretty good stuff overall, and being able to use this as a toolbox card in order to search. We got an upgrade on Develop Your Brain, but instead of costing 1, it does cost 2. But then again, instead of looking at the top 2, you look at the top 5. You put 1 into the hand and the rest to the bottom of the deck. That's a pretty good card. Again, Yu-Gi-Oh! Players know how insane cards like Pot of Prosperity is. This is Pot of Prosperity in Lorcana. I mean, Dig a Little Deeper can do it as well, but yeah, this card looks to be pretty good in my opinion. A card that is the opposite of that, not good in my opinion, and yeah, it got enchanted for some reason, is Royal Tantrum, a 4-cost inkable action that says banish any number of your items and then draw a card for each item banished this way. Not really something I'd want to consider playing at all, really. If I have my items on board, I want to keep them. Next up, we've got Ever As Before, an action song, a 2-cost inkable that says remove up to 2 damage from any number of chosen characters. So not relevant really. Next up we have Cusco in action form. It costs 2 and it's called Hideaway, and put chosen item or location into its player's inkwell face down and exerted. Not only is this a potential budget option for the people who don't want to spend on Cusco, it's still a very good card because you basically have a 2-cost removal. Yes, it puts it into the player's inkwell, so it's not great, but at least it gets the threat off the field, and hopefully you can stay ahead in card advantage, whereas giving them the extra ink, especially if it's early, which you want to avoid, can hopefully slow them down enough that they can't progress their board state and take it, and maybe not take advantage of that extra ink that you gave them. Alright, next up we got All Fund Out, a 1-cost inkable action that says put chosen characters of yours into your inkwell face down and exerted. So this card, in my opinion, it's not necessarily terrible. Like imagine playing a Mickey Mouse, getting ramp off it, and then using All Fund Out after you've quested with the Mickey, so that doesn't just get challenged and outed, which you know it will. But again, this card is a little bit too situational. You know, drawing this card probably feels really underwhelming. How much ramp do you really need? So all those things combined, I just don't think this displaces anything in the Sapphire decks in order to be played. Moving on to items now, we do have Medal of Heroes. You're able to pay 2 and exert this item in order to give a chosen character, pay 2, exert, and banish the item in order to give a chosen characters of yours a +2 lore this turn. So if you quest with them and then dime them, you know, you get the extra 2 lore the whole way through, which is great, which means you get 4 extra lore. There's maybe a couple other things you can do. However, overall, I don't think this card sees play. It's just slow and clunky, and you probably just are better off playing a character that can actually quest for 2 lore instead of trying to give it to one of your existing ones. Basil's Magnifying Glass is a 2-cost inkable item, so that's always good to see. You can exert and pay 2 to look at the top 3 cards of your deck, reveal an item card, put it into your hand, and the rest on the bottom. So an okay ability, but I just think the Queen is way stronger since you have the potential to play things for free. We're almost done here, guys. Looking at Merlin's Carpet Bag, it's a 5-cost uninkable item that you can exert and pay 1 and return an item card from your discard to your hand. So similar to the Prince John we just looked at, I think this one could potentially be pretty relevant simply because it's an item, so it's harder to out. But paying 1 to return an item card from discard to hand, and you can do this every single turn. And unlike Prince John, that has to, you know, exert itself or leave itself exerted when it uses its ability, this card is harder to out. You can exert it, not worry about it getting challenged and taken out, and still get the item back to your hand. Yes, the Prince John plays it for free, but this card is not necessarily bad considering the items you're bringing back are likely popsicles, you know, Shield of Virtues, Fortispheres, that kind of thing. Very low cost 1-drop items that are very powerful, but you know, you ended up having to discard them or use them at some point in order to get them into, or in order for them to go into the discard. And then, oh, okay, we got this, and then 2 locations. A 4-cost uninkable Sapphire Chromacon. This item enters play exerted, and then you can exert, pay 2 to banish one of your items to gain 2 lore. So you can just see right away, like these 2 things combo with each other, but they do both cost a lot and are uninkable. Next up, we've got the Great Illuminary, a Radiant Ballroom, a 3-cost inkable location that costs 2 to move there, but does have 9 willpower, and characters with support will get +1 lore and +2 willpower while here. So not something I think will be relevant at all, really. Like a support-based deck isn't really a thing, and the fact that it costs 2 to move here is really, really expensive for what you get. Maybe they will release a lot of good characters that have support as a supplemental ability, and then a card like this might become playable in order to beef them up, but for right now I just don't think that's the case. And then we have Merlin's Cottage, a 1-cost inkable item, costs 1 to move there, and has 7 willpower. Each player plays with the top card of their deck face up. Not relevant at all in my opinion. I mean, I say that, but you know, you get your opponent into a top deck mode and then you always see what their draw is, could definitely help you. However, again, it's just very situational and not a card I think that we'll see meta play. So that does it for the Sapphire review. If you made it this far in the video, let me know what you think. A lot of good cards as we outlined here, but that's going to wrap it up for this one, and stay tuned for the final one in Steel coming up soon. Thank you for watching, guys. Quantum is out.